Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. My guest today is Stephanie Peirolo, author of the newly released book The Saint and the Drunk, a guide to making the big decisions in your life. Stephanie is a board-certified executive coach with a BA from Stanford and an MA in Transformational Leadership from Seattle University's School of Theology and Ministry. She's a recovering alcoholic, and she's also an associate of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, an international community of Catholic sisters who work for peace through justice. She's a writer and broadcaster and has a newsletter on Substack, a podcast on leadership, and she provides consulting and trainings for corporate and non-profit organisations. Stephanie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Stephanie, for those who may not have listened to our first conversation, I just wonder if you can give us a brief synopsis of The Saint and the Drunk.
So it is a guide to making the big decisions in your life. And the foundational elements are teachings and theology, philosophy, ideas from the saint, who is Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who developed a process for making decisions called discernment, which he codified in the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The drunk is Bill Wilson, who was one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who came up with the 12 steps, which is again, codified process for changing your life so that you don't drink yourself to death. One of the concepts in 12-step recovery is this idea of a higher power, which is that you need to have a spiritual transformation in order to get sober, but your understanding of what spirit is up to you as an individual. So the higher power concept was something that was advocated by early members of AA who were agnostic or atheist. And it was adopted to say, as long as you believe in something bigger than you, we don't care what it is. It can be nature, your ancestors, whatever. We're not concerned about that. And that idea that you can have a spiritual transformation so fundamental that you can change your addiction to a substance, whether or not you believe in God, was interesting to me. And so my hope with the book was to take that foundation and move the Ignatian exercises away from a very specific Catholic, Christian, biblical-based set of exercises, using that higher power lens to make it open to people who were spiritual but not religious, part of another religious community, or just curious about matters that are consistent with making decisions with intention, ethics, and values.
You talk about in the book about how a listener and a reader can get a clearer and deeper relationship with their own inner wisdom and make more of their own learning in life. How do you distinguish between inner wisdom and higher power?
So one of the stories that I tell in the book is I have a granddaughter who is 5, and we go to church together every Sunday. And her parents don't go to church, but they like me taking her to church. And so whenever she is asking me questions about the Episcopal faith, we go to an Episcopal church, or what are these beings that are drawn with wings? I always use the phrase, some people believe that. Some people believe that there are angels. Some people believe that, when I fill that in. And so my hope in the book was to say some people believe this. It may or may not resonate for you. My granddaughter at 5 is capable of coming up with her own understanding of what the divine is to her. And I can just say, some people believe. And so the first part of that is that if we can start by believing that we have access to knowledge that is valid for us, that can guide us, that's the first step, right? Is like, you know, stuff about what you are called to do in the world, and that is valuable. And I want to help you listen to that voice to identify and act on those promptings. For many people, their higher power can be part of that inner knowing. Right? But I don't want to exclude anybody, right? So for me, in my spiritual practice, my inner knowing is influenced by many factors, including my upbringing, my family, my culture, my experiences. But I also believe that my higher power gives me guidance, which a lot of people don't believe. And so I wanted to make it open to people. Everyone has an inner knowing. And I believe that all of us should honor our inner knowing. And for those of us who are women or part of marginalized communities, that often means returning to something that the culture has tried to separate us from. And for others, depending on where you are in your spiritual practice or belief system, there are people who can get guidance from someplace outside of themselves. And neither one is better. Everyone is at whatever place they are. But to me, the discernment process is one where I open myself up to influence that is larger than me. Again, nature, ancestors, the divine, whatever that may be, because that's where the wisdom is turbocharged as far as I'm concerned. Both are valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. I do have a sense of higher and greater, and also just helping someone to make their best decision. And I think that's some of the wonderful practicality of the book. And I also was quite surprised getting into the book how you start off with St. Ignatius and with Bill Wilson and very strong Christian. I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a real spiritual book in inverted commas. And then surprising actually how practical it was. There was spirit and the spirituality if I wanted it, but actually if I didn't, it was just a kick-ass way of making better decisions. What initial ideas would you have for suggestions for how someone could integrate a more intentional approach to discernment and better decision making into their daily lives when time feels so limited?
There's a couple of practical things in the book that I think are useful in small pieces. So the book is meant to be read in any way that seems useful, right? So you can just go straight to what seems to resonate for you. But there's a section that talks about kind of building a map. This talks about making any big decision, but it also focuses a lot on decisions that have to do with vocation, career, work. The first thing is to reframe your understanding of what inputs to decision are valuable, right? We tend to think about a decision-making process as intellectual, and we usually go to a list of pros and cons. Sometimes we are told we should listen to other experts and take on their particular thoughts and ideas for how to make a decision. Our family often has a lot of ideas and votes as to what we should be doing or what we should be focusing on or what. And so the first part is to be clear about what your parameters are. Right? How much money do you actually have to make? Like just there's a whole practical aspect, right? Because I understand what it's like to need to work multiple jobs as a single mother to support my kids. So I wanted to be grounded in the reality that many of us have real financial and caregiving responsibilities that are not we can't just wave away, right? So trying to be grounded in reality. The second is really interrogating what cultural narratives are helping or hindering you. right? And I give a list, and each list has a short chapter with a lot of reflection questions, but thinking about ideas around, what work is important, who gets to have money and how do they get to spend it, who is allowed to quit and in what circumstances. I talk in the book of a young friend of mine who went to law school, passed the bar, and realized he hated the law. And I said, well, why don't you go do something else? He's like, but then I would be wasting my law school education. I'm not allowed to quit, because he had a very strong cultural and family narrative that if you quit, quote unquote, you are a failure, right? And so the idea is to look practically at what narratives are you carrying unwillingly or unwittingly that you can release? Or alternatively, are there narratives that are really empowering to you? Right. So when I was growing up, I have one sister, and my dad treated us like he would have treated boys. Right. Like, before you learn how to drive a car, you have to know how to change a tire, change the fan belt, check the oil. You will have a career, you will go to college, you will, he didn't treat me any differently than he would have treated a boy. And his narrative about my abilities was supportive. It was something that was really helpful to me. And so that's another practical aspect. And then this move from just honoring the intellect into looking at honoring other ways of knowing. Right. So when Ignatius focuses a lot on imagination, sensations in your body, and I think that there's a somatic wisdom, I call it the genius of the body, where we can tap into really deep knowing that may not even have words. But if we know what to look for and we are able to honor that, it can be really helpful. And then the last part is dealing with and honoring resistance. What do you do when you are struggling to make a decision? How do you make decisions in a season of bereavement? How do you navigate trauma or physical pain if you're trying to learn how to access the genius of the body? So again, trying to keep this grounded in real life experience, because we can't all make decisions in an environment where we are not impacted by financial realities, caregiving realities, bereavement, loss, all the messiness of life. How do we still stay connected to that kind of intentional compass to guide us?
Yeah. There's some things you talk about within the book, and there's a tension between doing your true work and the pressures of the economy and family life. And I just wondered, how can we begin to identify our true work amidst all the professional and family responsibilities that we may have, and what small steps could we take to move us towards that?
Well, the idea of this notion of true work came up because there were a couple of younger people that I spoke to in the process of putting together this book to get their perspective. And they were really useful. And two of the women that I talked to are both artists. And one of them uses the phrase, the idea of econ, right? Like, her true work is her art, but it doesn't pay the bills. So she has a job. And I just found that to be a really useful distinction, because her calling, how she wants to move through the world, is to do her art. That is her true work. For many of us, what we are called to, our vocation, is not enough to pay the bills. And in some cases, it is something that is dismissed by maybe our family, our culture, or society, right? So I think of someone who is an artist. Maybe they're a scholar. Maybe they're very involved in their community. They may be a parent. There's many things that people are called to do that are their work in the world that's deeply satisfying to them, that is not honored. And so I think recognizing that you may be called to do something that does not make you money, it's still valid. It still counts. And you still get to make decisions in your life to support that as a dream. right? It doesn't all have to be about making money. However, most of us do not have the privilege to ignore our financial responsibilities. So we have to do that. And it is very challenging. There is a tension because one of the things that I talk about in the book is the notion that we have to rest. We need to treat ourselves as humans who need rest. And this whole notion of hustle culture is anathema to our well-being as humans, right? And so it's not saying, okay, if you have this vocation and you're an artist, you should do your art full time and also do your job full time. And that's not the idea. It's honoring that you can be called to something and also need to take care of your financial well-being or whatever other responsibilities you have. All of those things are important and you get to prioritize them as you see fit, which for some people can be very challenging, especially if they are in a family system or a culture that tells them that it's all about the money.
You introduced the concept of inner community and the voice of Barbara. I just and just knowing what's coming next, obviously we want to honor any people listening to the podcast who happen to be called Barbara. I just wonder if you could take us through those ideas.
So I have a spiritual director, and she introduced me to this notion of an inner community. And it is not a new concept. People talk about family systems, or there's different ways of referring to it, but it's the idea that within us we have an inner community of different personalities, and all of those personalities are going to have ideas or opinions about what we should be doing. I am a very visual thinker, so I literally know what they look like and I know what they wear and I know who's who. But the idea, so for example, there might be a member of our inner community who is very afraid. Right? I have a member of my inner community who's the worst case scenario girl, who is constantly screaming, the plane is going to crash. You're going to lose all your money. It's very dramatic, right? There's another part of my inner community that is much more kind of practical, confident, connected. And so the idea is that we have different members of our inner community, and it's useful for us to identify who those are. For some people, it might be an unskillful relative, a difficult parent. They still have that voice in their head saying whatever crummy things that person said to you when you were a child. For other people, there may be some part of themselves that's really drawn to art or beauty or creation. And so identifying who's in your inner community has, for me, been a really useful tool, because sometimes those voices are really loud, right? And so one of my best friends introduced me to this notion of Barbara, right? And so Barbara, again, apologies to any actual Barbers who are listening. I don't know why we came up with Barbara, but this idea, imagine you're in a group, a community group or whatever, and one person, Barbara, is monopolizing the conversation. And Barbara is saying a stream of really negative things. You know, you're never going to do this. What do you mean you think you can be an artist? You're crazy to write a book in your 60s and think that it's going to get published. Whatever it is that your Barbara says, to kindly engage and say, thanks for sharing, Barbara. We're done listening to Barbara. We appreciate your contribution and point of view, but you can stop talking now. Let's hear from someone else. And there's something about that idea. It caught fire with friends of ours, and I've used it with clients. And certainly most people recognize that really negative, critical, damaging, limiting voice. And something about having a name for that voice and having an admonition. Thanks for sharing. We're done hearing from you. It's time for someone else in the inner community to stand up, has proven to be a very effective tool for me and a number of my friends and clients.
And I think one of the things I've found with that kind of thing is to acknowledge the positive intent can't we? Can acknowledge it of what Barbara or that negative voice is trying to do, and at the same time avoiding it becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because it's dominating the conversation, like you say.
Having some compassion for Barbara, right?
Yeah.
So my Barbara voice is trying to protect me.
Yeah.
Don't have too many dreams because you could be disappointed. Right. And so understanding that, approaching Barbara with the same compassion and curiosity that I would try to approach someone difficult in my community, not shutting her down, but not letting her dominate. And by giving her a name and becoming curious, it has been a real place of spiritual growth for me.
Yeah. And if we acknowledge that Barbara's got to be holding a lot of our losses, hasn't she?
Yeah.
To be able to say stuff like that, she's got to be holding a lot of that, a lot of the times when things haven't worked out for us,
Mm-hmm.
and honoring that contribution. Right? And I know you mentioned just a little while ago about rest, and I'd really like to come back to it. It's so against the prevailing mood, right? When it's everything's 24/7 and it's go, go, go. And I just wondered what if there's any mindset shifts or practical strategies that we could adopt to better prioritize rest in our lives and also to connect with our inner wisdom as we do that.
Well, one of the books that I read when I was writing this book is called The Nap Ministry by a woman named Tricia Hersey, who is an artist and an activist. She's a Black woman who talks about rest as resistance. And she refers to her book as a manifesto. And I would highly recommend that you read that book because she talks about how reclaiming rest is a radical act of resistance. And we are in this capitalist system that is telling us that we need to do more and hustle more, and that actually we need to rest. And she focuses specifically on how, as a Black woman, rest is reparations, it's reclamation. And it was very influential to me in thinking about rest. But one of the things that Ignatius talks about, and I can't remember the exact quote, but I talk about it in the book, is that we need to honor our human nature. Right? And anything that we do that's in violation of our humanness is antithetical to spiritual progress. And I really appreciate that because if I am expecting myself to work 15 hours a day and never rest and do all of these things, I'm not honoring myself as a human being. And one of the things that I think we have trouble with in talking about work or spirituality is to recognize we are embodied beings and our bodies matter. And we need to feed ourselves and move and rest and be in connection with other people. And any career decision, any work, any schedule or lifestyle that precludes us being able to rest and sleep and play and break bread with our loved ones is antithetical to our well-being as humans. And that should be honored. And so one of the things that I suggest to people is, as you are deciding what this decision is, look at the implications for your ability to rest, to play, to take a vacation, to meditate, to be alone if you're an introvert, to get the things that are enlivening to you. And if you're contemplating a set of actions or a decision that's going to not let you do that, you should look at that as a warning bell. And obviously, some of us need to do that at certain periods of time. I've mentioned there was a period of time when my kids were young where I worked 7 days a week at 3 different jobs because I had to feed them. And so obviously there are exceptions, but generally prioritizing our integrity as human beings is important.
Yeah. And a wonderful thing on that, you mentioned it earlier, is the idea of the genius of the body. We can get so disconnected from our physical selves. I just wonder what are some of the gentle ways that we can begin to reestablish this connection and listen to the body's wisdom in our decision making.
So the first is, I think, just to establish that connection, right? And a lot of people are cut off from the genius of their bodies. And I just want to honor the fact that for some people, especially people who have had trauma, especially sexual abuse or sexual assault, or people who are in chronic pain, that this may be difficult for them. And so I specifically address that in the book. And I talk about ways that if the genius of the body is not yours, there are lots of other ways for you to get your information. So just to put that out there. But the first is to start paying attention to what your body is telling you, right? And so one of the exercises that I talk about is to pick a sense and play with it for a day or a week over a period of time. So, for example, if the sense that you are exploring is taste, eat your favorite foods, savor them, cook yourself a special meal. If what you're focusing on is hearing, listen to music, be in nature in silence and pay attention. Sensual pleasure is a great bridge to understanding the genius of the body. Right? Whether it's taking a bath or getting a massage, sex, there's so many ways into seeing your body as more than just a sack of meat that carries your head around, right? To really make friends with what it is that your body enjoys. And then the other thing is to try to listen to your body. So I enjoy exercise, and sometimes I find that sensations or feelings or thoughts will arise as I am exercising, particularly if I'm doing something meditative like walking or swimming. And to just sort of check in, right? So I'm sure you've heard of people who keep a dream journal by their bed. And if they wake up, they'll write down their dream so they don't forget it. Think of that model when you are doing something in your body, right? What comes up for you while you are swimming or running? What comes up for you when you are, I don't know, putting your makeup on or putting lotion on, or, do any emotions arise when you are sexually intimate with someone else? Like, what comes up for you? And just almost like tune into that channel and just see like what it is. Like, I've had times where I'll be swimming and I feel fine when I get in the pool, and I get out and I am mad. Or I'll find that sometimes grief will come up. Like, there were years I lost my son, and after he died, I actually stopped swimming for a while because I would start crying when I was swimming. I would be fine getting into the pool, but I was carrying that grief in my body, and I would cry so much that my goggles would get steamed up. And so I was like, okay, I need to do an exercise where I can cry and not steam up my goggles. And that was where I first got that understanding of some of us can carry a lot of emotions in our bodies. Sometimes the way we know that is through aches and pains. And I'm not talking about an injury. I'm talking about like all of a sudden that crick in your neck or the like deep ache in your knee. Sometimes it can be useful, in addition to going to a physical therapist or what have you, to get curious. What am I carrying? Why do I feel like I have this pain in this particular place? And just sit with it. Just get curious and be open to any information that may float up.
Fascinating. One of the wonderful things that you write about are the importance of recognizing our skills and superpowers. I just wondered if you could share some things on that topic for the listeners.
Yeah, because part of, if we're making decisions, we want to accurately assess what it is that we are dealing with. And what I have found as an executive coach is that a lot of people, particularly women, but not exclusively women, don't understand the skills that they have. Right. So I remember talking to a client who was in an operational role, and she was talking to me about how she organized something at work. And it was clear to me immediately that she had this kind of genius. She could just see a system and understand what was blocking and what needed to change. And to her, it was so natural that it was like, what? You mean everybody can't do that? And I said to her, no, everyone cannot do that. That is a superpower. And I think that it is important for us to recognize what we do well and build on those skills, and also take the confidence that we can from that competence. And a lot of times we have skills that we just assume everybody else takes for granted. Like, doesn't everybody else read sheet music like I do? You mean other people don't have perfect pitch? You mean you can't multiply like 3-digit numbers in your head? And smaller things, right? And so one of the things that I suggest, and I think this is particularly helpful for people who are early in their career, deciding what they want to do, is to look at things that other people know you do well. Right. Sometimes it is our friends that recognize this. So I give the example of a young person who is always the one who plans the parties because he plans the best parties. And if you are the one that plans the best parties, then maybe you could look at that as a skill and see if that gives you some kind of cue or information as to what it is that you might enjoy doing. For example, doing event planning or something. And so, because I think we focus a lot on the things we don't do well, but I think we also need to focus on the things we do well. And there's a couple of things that can be cues for that. What are your skills? Also, what do you enjoy doing? Like, what are your hobbies? Where do you find like, oh my gosh, I can't believe 5 hours just passed and I didn't even notice it because I was so engrossed in whatever the thing is. Because the way that I think of discernment is kind of like a scavenger hunt, right? You're trying to find cues and clues as you go along. Some of those clues come from your personality, some of them come from your history, some of them come from your dreams and desires. And discernment is just a way of orienting yourself so you're always looking for answers and you have an expectation that there will be another clue, an answer, and this will be useful to me and I will get what I need to make the decision that I'm trying to make.
I think your concept of clues from childhood is a wonderful um, clue finder there, or a wisdom finder.
The first memory that I have is of writing my name. So I'm holding a pencil and I'm writing my name. That is the first thing that I remember. And I remember loving school, loving office supplies. I remember getting a really old typewriter. All of my memories have to do with this deep desire and drive to be a writer from the time I was a little kid. Right? It was clear that that's what I was called to be and do. And I think for a lot of us, we look at things that we were drawn to as children and we can make that connection. So when my daughter was very young, she wanted Grey's Anatomy, the book. This wasn't the TV show. She was a little kid and she wanted the actual anatomy book. And I was like, why? You're 8. She's like, no, I really want. I was like, all right, all right. So I got it for her. And now she's a grown woman and she's a nurse. She's been an ICU nurse and an emergency room nurse. And it is not a surprise to me that she went into the medical field because it was something that was so interesting to her. I remember her sitting next to me when we would be in mass and she was like, she would look at my hands and be like just fascinated by the tendons and the veins. And she was just, every time if somebody got a cut, it would be like she'd be the one with the bandage. And it was clear to me as her mother that that was something that was interesting to her. So it surprised me not at all that she became a nurse. And so I think the idea that sometimes these things that we are fascinated by or thrilled by or interested in as children are not like kind of childish whimsy. It's actually an indication that this is what our calling is.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful story. Now, some other concept that jumped out at me in the book was the idea of attraction and aversion, and how it can sometimes be subtle attraction and subtle aversion that can really help us make better decisions. I wonder if you can just give us some sense on how we can use those concepts in our lives to make better choices.
So attraction and aversion is useful for people who, especially for people who are not where the wisdom, the genius of the body does not resonate, because it's not just intellectual, it's more emotional and intuitive, but it's not, it doesn't have to be body based. One of the examples that I use is if I'm talking to a woman in her 50s who is trying to make a decision about what she wants to do between her current employment and her retirement 15, 20 years down the road. If she starts telling me that the last 4 books she read and the last 5 movies she watched were about a woman moving to Italy and buying a house, I am going to say to her, let's think about that for a minute. Why are you so drawn to stories and portrayals of women moving to another country, a specific country, and doing and building a house? What is it that's drawing you to that? Right? And so I think that being able to listen to, I'm sure that you have experienced, younger people talk about this a lot, like when you fall in love, every song that you hear appears to be a love song, right? If you're expecting a child, suddenly you notice pregnant people everywhere you go. There's a kind of highlighter in our attention that will call our minds and our spirits and our emotions to certain things. And I just think we should look at that those are really useful cues. And so what you're drawn to in terms of art or experience or what you keep dreaming about or thinking about is valuable. The aversion side, so in our culture, we are very enamored of the positive. And I like to look at the negative as being equally useful, right? So the idea of aversion as valuable means when you really hate something, if you have an intense loathing, that is also useful information. And sometimes we're embarrassed by a strong loathing, or we feel like it is somehow judgmental or unkind, what even if we're just thinking it in our heads. And an example that I use sometimes when I'm doing this in retreat is of a woman who is trying to discern whether or not she wants to have a child because her partner really wants to have a child. And she goes to visit her sister who has a new baby. And her entire experience as she visits her sister and takes care of her little niece is an aversion reaction. She notices the smell of dirty diapers and the fact that the house is a mess and that her sister is recovering from a C-section. And all she can think about is this overwhelming feeling of disgust. Like, I don't want to do this with my body. In that scenario, you can understand women who might feel judgmental about that aversion, who might feel like they're being too critical or but I say honor that. If this woman is having a real visceral sense of disgust and her first response as soon as she gets home is to take a 5-mile run to reclaim her physical strength and autonomy, that's really valid information. Apophatic and cataphatic understanding of the divine, right? And we tend to think of cataphatic as a spiritual fruitcake, right? People who are like, I feel connected to God and I pray and I feel wonderful and I feel God in all of these places and I know God through the positive, through my beliefs, through the Bible, through scripture, whatever. There are all these things in this fruitcake of my belief that teach me what the divine is. Apophatic belief is, I know what God is not. And most religious traditions do not honor that. But it is actually a very important way to get to the divine. For people who say, I know that for me, God is not judgmental. God does not say only certain people are saved. God is not about this. And the negative way is really important for some people. And there's very little language that says that emptiness, this is not it, I don't want this, is a really valid and important and vital way to get information about what you want to do. So part of what I'm writing about in aversion is the larger idea of honoring the negative as useful information about what it is that you are discerning.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Love that. One of the things that resonated a great deal, I loved how you talked about the importance of having deeper and better relationships, and you talk about the concept of inordinate attachments. So for professionals often and parents as well, and mums and dads is that often you can feel isolated and the lack of a strong support system for personal reflection. I just wonder what are some of the ways that we could build and find that supported community or trusted advisor.
Well, I think in terms of finding community, um, I think that the first thing to do is to look around and see what's possibly right in front of you. It is easier for people who are part of a religious tradition or who are in fact in some sort of recovery to find community. So if you know that applies to you, then definitely use the communities that are already made in front of you. Most people need to find community they need to work a little harder. And so I look at the idea of kind of friends of the road and friends of the heart, that it's nice to find other people who are in the same season of life as you are and don't have too great expectations of community. Community can be loose bonds. I mean, when my kids were growing up, I had a very strong community of other parents who I sat on the sidelines at sporting events with for years. For years, we sat next to each other in rainy days watching our kids play whatever sport they were playing. That is community. It's the notion of recognizing and honoring community. It could be the people that are at your local coffee shop that you see. But I think for people who want a more intentional community, it's looking at ways to do that, right? You can gather around something that is important to you, right? Volunteer at an organization that helps animals, get involved in your community in a civic organization or politically, even recreationally. People who like to go swim in the ocean, go swim in the ocean together and then get together for coffee afterwards. So I think it's recognizing it, prioritizing it, and then being willing to build your own. I mean, I have a section of the book that says, here's how you can use this book and this process to build community. And a lot of us are out of practice of building community. People talk about how hard it is to make friends as we're older. And I certainly spend a lot of time in front of screens and less time sort of out in the world. And although you can form community online as well, I mean, you and I are talking, we are communicating, we are building a bond, and we are in different countries and different time zones looking at each other over a screen. That can also be valid. I think the other point is when you talked about a trusted advisor, I just want to mention that as a separate thing. And it is something that I talk about in the book because Ignatius and Bill Wilson both talk about the importance of having someone that you can run your ideas by, right? For Ignatius, it's a priest who's acting as a spiritual director. For people in recovery, it's a sponsor who is an advisor who will help you go through the 12 steps. And I do think it is important for you to have someone who you can run things by, because we don't always get it right. And sometimes we will be subsumed in old narratives or voices from our inner community that are not skillful. And we need somebody else, right? And it doesn't have to be a priest. It could be a trusted elder. I mean, one of the people that I talk to is my Aunt Tanya, because I love her. She's known me since I was a baby. We have very similar values. And if I'm trying to make a decision, I will get together with her because I value her opinion. We are not always encouraged to trust another person and to build those ties outside of maybe our spouse or partner or immediate family. And so a lot of us have lost that habit, right? Like we may pay a therapist or, people pay me to be an executive coach, but the idea of forming bonds that are not professional, where you trust another person, you take their advice, you have a mutual support, and you're not just going to play darts or exchanging gossip. You're really trying to help one another grow, because your friends and people in that role can give you information that you won't get any other way. Self-examination has its own limits because we are limited beings, and sometimes we need that outside perspective.
I know you have a relationship with a group of nuns.
Yeah, I do. And one of the things that happened, so my son died 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years this summer. And the grief was so bad that I kind of just withdrew. Like it was all I could do to parent my daughter and, go to work. And I realized after a few years that I had become so isolated that it was damaging me. And so I tried to be really intentional about community. And I had grown up Catholic. I had left the Catholic Church. And a friend of mine that I had gone to graduate school with was ordained as an Episcopal priest, a woman. And she said, come to my church. So I was like, okay, I'll go to this Episcopal church. And I walked in and I felt a very strong sense of attraction. I thought, I like these people. I like this community. And I started attending that church. And I was introduced to this community of nuns. They're the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. They're in England and New Jersey and the Pacific Northwest. And I live in Seattle. And I went to a retreat and I felt that same sense of connection with these nuns. I consider them to be radical feminists. They are very, very progressive. And they've also kind of stepped out of many cultural narratives as women who are vowed religious. Most of them are in their 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Many of them have never been married. They were always teachers or nuns or professors. And I found myself really attracted to their values. They're very focused on social justice. They believe in radical hospitality, welcome to all. Sometimes I'm like, you're really Catholic? They're like, yeah, we're really Catholic. And they were just such a great example to me of women in community that I became what's called an associate. Most religious orders have associates. Sometimes they're called oblates. And what you do is you say, this organization, religious communities have what's called a charism, which is their work in the world, what they do. For my community, it's peace through justice. And associates attach themselves to that charism. We say, we are part of this community. We believe in that charism, and we will support one another in doing that. And this order happens to have a very vital and engaged and involved group of associates. And so that community has been really pivotal for me. In fact, it was this community that suggested that I write this book. I actually wrote it when I needed to just get out of my house. I would go to their place in Bellevue that's right by Lake Washington, and it's beautiful. I would sit in this little room and I'd look out over the water, and there were eagles, and I would write. I'd go and have lunch with the nuns and talk about whatever we were talking about, and then I'd come back and write some more. And they really supported me through writing this process. The book would not exist without that community and that community support. And it's funny because one of the nuns in leadership, Sister Susan, we had a community meeting, and she got up and she said, Stephanie's writing a book about discernment. And I didn't have a publisher. I hadn't even finished the book, but it was this sense of this whole group of women just like clapping. Hey, Stephanie's writing a book. Let's support her. Let's help her. Let's invite her. And it's that idea of being the writer in the family, right? Susan is herself a writer, but this notion of people who are companioning you, walking with you, supporting you, and celebrating you certainly was instrumental to me in the lonely, difficult, challenging process of writing a book and getting it out in the world. Mm. And we call ourselves nun adjacent.
Right. I think one of the answer, it's a beautiful answer in itself, but I think it also as well, and it offers people, I hope, reassurance of just how much depth there is in what you write about, and it's there if people want it, and if they don't, they just get a fabulous set of tools. My encouragement, just thank you very much for writing the book and for all that you're doing, and I just encourage everyone just to go out and get hold of the book because it's absolutely terrific. So thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website www.shepheard-walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. and you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading